Testing. There's gonna be like 80 million of these. The focus of today's video is a short story called Sheldon Shakes a Shoggoth by Ezra Wayne, and it is from an anthology called Sheldon Shakes a Shoggoth and Other Racy and Awkward Fantasy Tales. This video will therefore contain discussion of kink, of sexuality, and this is your forewarning before you watch further that we will go in depth with it in so much as it aids the discussion of the plot and themes and transness of the story. Shapeshifting is perhaps one of the most interesting and commonly used tropes for trans and non-binary characters, and we can see that with popular examples like Double Trouble from She-Ra, and of course it'd be remiss to leave out Loki from the Marvel Cinematic Universe and comics and whatnot as well. And the way that shapeshifting is often implemented is that it kind of justifies why the character is trans or non-binary to some degree. Like, the whole point is because the character can shift between genders, then they must be both or neither or whatever they choose to be in that moment. You almost never have a shape-shifting trans character of one specific gender, right? They tend to be non-binary to some degree. If not, like stated, it will be sort of implicitly implied that they're non-binary. And often I have to wonder, is this implying that the body indicates the gender, in which case I don't see how that coincides a whole lot with transness, unless we're talking about like transition care. But like the idea of, because this character can change form between one that is female appearing or male appearing, that impacts their gender. The idea inherently that your body must somehow be tied to what gender you are, which isn't quite how it works all the time. That's why transition care is a thing, obviously, because you have the option to transition. But when it comes to shape-shifting characters, it justifies it in a way that almost feels reliant on like what parts the character may have, how the character may be presenting, yada yada. It's almost like that's the idea, as opposed to maybe how they internally identify. It always seems to be a focus on how they externally appear being indicative of that. So for this video, I wanted to talk about a short story that is part of an anthology that involves transness and shapeshifting and multiple trans characters of different identities. And it kind of at once plays into these tropes, at twice it subverts them. And I want to discuss that because in this short story we have a shape-shifting demon character that is non-binary that can essentially look like whatever they want to look like, but they sort of have their preferences for how they enjoy looking, but they can shift their appearance really however. The main character is a non-binary trans man who gains some modicum of shape-shifting abilities, and then there is another character who shows up kind of at the tail end of the story as a love interest who is a trans woman. So I'm kind of interested in how shapeshifting as a trope ties these character stories together. Now, before I continue on with the trans and shapeshifting topic, I would like to take a moment, as I do in all of these videos, and as I will continue to do, to remind you of some of the parallels of the stuff that I talk about and other issues that are ongoing. I think it's kind of important to understand that a lot of the ways that trans people, trans identity gets treated and diminished is paralleled in the way that other marginalized identities do, especially when we are talking about oppressive forces such as fascism. And if you look at the way that Palestinians are treated and Ukrainians are treated, there is this similar trend of treating someone like their identity, their culture, their background, it's fake, it's manufactured. So you're not really trans, or trans identity isn't a real thing. And that's kind of used almost as a cudgel as a way to attempt to make people assimilate or get over it or leave that part of themselves behind. And you can see that enacted here, right? Like the idea that Palestine isn't a country, shouldn't be a country, that they shouldn't have their own land. And like the arguments being used to justify the invasion of Ukraine, that it isn't really a country, that it's false, that there isn't like a Ukrainian identity, that it's manufactured. And like I always do, I have resources in the description for you to check out and to donate to, because I don't think that you should be watching these videos and only be concerned about issues that may pertain to you personally. I think that you should care more broadly about what is happening in the world. So in the description, you will find a link to the Come Back Alive Foundation, the National Bank of Ukraine, the Serhiy Pertula Charity Foundation, the Palestine Children's Relief Fund, the Palestine Red Crescent Society, and Doctors Without Borders. And I urge you, like I always do, even if you can't donate, share them around. Someone probably can, and anything helps. Thank you. Now, for this particular discussion, I have kind of a treat for you. I have two other people who will be sharing their perspectives on the story. One is arguably my co-host, who is kind of helping me put this whole thing together, and as I plan and read and make notes and write, he's like really had my back. So I will have a section where he discusses specifically the kink aspect of this story, as this is an erotic short story, and I'm not particularly well versed in erotica. I read it sometimes, I edit it sometimes. It's just not my like specialty when it comes to fiction, so I won't pretend that it is. And then I also have a little voice clip from the author himself talking about his perspective on the story that he wrote and some of the inspiration behind it. So both of those are coming up soon. One particular aspect of kink that is relevant to this story, not directly, I would say perhaps indirectly, and Thomas will go into more thorough discussion of that, but the idea of having a partner, or in this case, sort of a hookup, who knows what you want without you really having to vocalize it. And if you've ever heard the song Baby It's Cold Outside, which has it's gotten on and off some heat, some flack for the like lyrics and the presentation of the song, and like to some extent I understand it, but I also think it's really important to take into consideration that it is a tongue-in-cheek song. It's just playing on the idea of like someone who is not really in a position to say yes, but who wants to, being pressured into it. And the whole reason that exists is because when you have groups of people, namely women, but we're expanding past that because we're talking about trans stuff too. When you have groups of people who are, I guess the best term to use is sexually repressed. They're discouraged from expressing their desires or what they might enjoy in a partner or in a sexual situation. They're discouraged from it. It's kind of seen as distasteful to be open about that. Then you kind of, from that, blooms this desire to, well, if you can't vocalize it, you still want someone to understand you and know what you want. So that's a huge part of where the sort of kink aspect around dubious consent or tentacles comes into play, but the story is a little bit different because it has a much stronger focus on consent. It's kind of half playing into it, half subverting it, and I will turn you over to Thomas for more thorough discussion of that.
The key themes of tentacle media are non-consent and anonymity. From the lack of communication springs a lack of obligation. In this decadent masturbatory fantasy, you are required to do nothing but exist. No reciprocation, just stimulation. In the ultimate objectification, you are reduced to your component parts. What you can provide the tentacle monster. A means to say to right, a vessel used to achieve replication, or perhaps merely a convenient incubator. If it deposits eggs, it does so without care to open or close systems. Instead of being handled gently or reverently, you're treated carelessly. Your pleasure is incidental, and more than likely being biohacked to artificially reduce resistance. It's a hard thing to articulate, let alone request from a partner. There are limited alternatives to explore that sensation solo. The incidental touch, almost like the incidental sounds highlighted in ASMR, is hard to come by safely, especially if you want it combined with minimal to no communication. There are theories that people enjoy forced fantasies because it allows them to desire without having to contend with the shame associated with said acts. After all, if you were forced to do it, it's not your fault. You get what you really want without the humiliation of naming your deepest desires. This applies to a variety of subgenres: feminization, multiple partners, covered in secretions, transformation, among other things, that admitting to means opening yourself up to judgment, if only from yourself. In a world without sexual shame, this theory almost seems to imply these things wouldn't be so prevalent. From a writer's perspective, it's pure convenience. No names to come up with, no pelvises to angle, no limbs to be tangled, no grand motives, and certainly no breakfast in bed. Your readers are already suspending their disbelief. The hardest part is the setup. And after that, smooth sailing. Then there are consenticles. Sheldon Shags a Shoggoth is decidedly in the latter category. Not only does the tentacle beast have a name, but they have a personality. The story follows Sheldon as he couples with Anna, the nominally genderless yet decidedly feminine Shoggoth, and eventually Jo, a transgender woman whom Sheldon has been crushing on for years. While Sheldon's coupling with Anna is detailed, that which he has with Jo is glossed over. There is a magical prosthetic that sits on the wrong bank of the uncanny valley. Leaving it on for too long has Lovecraftian consequences. For me, a trans man magically transforming into a cis man is a deal breaker. It triggers intense dysphoria. It feels like a mockery of the barriers I've faced. With a few words, everything is perfect. Initially, I liked that there were consequences. However, upon further reflection and discussion with trans men who have had bottom surgery, I find it unfortunately falls into the category of we can always tell. People always will be able to know. And they just can't get it 100% right. And other things that people say about bottom surgery. The problem is common. Consenticles are the inverse, not the opposite, of tentacle media. Like when you set out to break stereotypes, but if you do it long enough, then when you break the stereotypes you've made, you end up recreating the dominant culture. It goes like this. Monsters are supposed to be scary and evil. They are bad. When you're interested in being ravished by a monster, you've inverted the thing. Instead of fear, horny. When you invert that into consenticles, you run the risk of inadvertently reinforcing the dominant culture. Horror terrors beyond imagination have a natural affinity for transgender people. A Shoggoth is, when it comes down to it, a demon. Demons are, but considered evil. This demon is happy to aid the dysphoric trans man in his transition. without informing him of all the consequences. Thus, inadvertently, transition is linked with body horror, and transgender people are linked with demons. Not intentionally, of course, but nonetheless. Intention does not negate effect.
I will now turn you over to a voice recording from Ezra Owain himself about his story, and I hope to do this for indie books and stories especially. I really, really hope that I can get into contact with a lot of the writers and see if they would be interested in being featured. I think that it will help add a lot of perspective onto whether this is a story that maybe you'd be really interested in reading, or at the very least, if you just like these discussions, it will add layers onto the video and onto your experience, ideally. And I think for a lot of the indie books, especially if I'm like mutuals with the writer to any degree, I will definitely reach out to them and do this more in the future.
Sheldon is a queer man who accepts the mantle of a transhuman shapeshifter, first through alien technology, and later by a more wholesale symbiosis with that same extra-dimensional race. I created him during the first year of the pandemic, not knowing how important he was going to be. I didn't specifically plan for him to be trans and intersex either. That came up when I was exploring his motivation for trying out the alien prosthetic. I had had some abortive early attempts at writing queer representation in my erotica, and basically been told, hey, just stick to what you know. But all I really know is cisgender human MF pairings. I'm bisexual, so that doesn't even satisfy the breadth of my own interest in people, to say nothing of my being sexually attracted to monsters. So, I gave it another go. Sheldon opened his heart to me in ways my previous queer characters wouldn't do. Maybe it's because he is still part author insert, he's neurodivergent and slutty like I am, he is soft-hearted and kind of a himbo like I am, but also, he definitely reflects traits of friends of mine who are transmasc, things I'd like to embody more myself. He's courageous, empathetic, thick-skinned, and more than a little sassy. His journey is a journey from already having a healthy working relationship with his gender dysphoria, to gaining the freedom to reshape his sexy bits into the form of his choosing for the duration of a sexual encounter, to ultimately becoming more than human, able to encompass many forms and have sex with many species of intelligent life. And once I had a handle on Sheldon, writing other queer characters didn't seem quite so daunting. Things started to fall into place. So I continued to populate his world and other worlds like it with lots and lots of gayness. Pretty much everyone in the anthology is bi or pansexual.
Now, in the story Sheldon Shakes a Shoggoth, Sheldon Steinmetz is implied to be non-binary. It's a very small implication. It comes in the form of him wearing a plaid shirt near the ending of the story that is in the non-binary colors. And I have been made aware that in a later edition of the story, that has been switched to simply trans flag colors. So this is a little bit more up in the air, but it is at the very least implied in the published version through Phosphor Press, where you can get like the print, like the full anthology itself and the print copies. This is in that version of it. And as sort of like an asterisk, I was involved in the publishing of it. I work with Phosphor Press as an editor and an artist, so I edit all of our books, and this is of course one of them. I also did the cover spread art, and it is some little artworks throughout the story itself, and I've been kind of present for the development of the story for a long time now. I beta read it years ago when it was in its infancy, and then I went and edited it again before it was published. So it's one of those stories where I'm happy just to kind of see it out in the world regardless of, you know, every single individual reader's perspective on it. I think that they're all super interesting, and it was very, very cool to be a part of it. Another important Sheldon fact, kind of take note of, it is implied as well that he's intersex. It's canonical. It's more or less stated, like, when he's discussing his body, particularly his genitalia, the way that he describes it leads to that implication. Now, obviously, since I edited it and I interacted with the author, I know that that's the case. I'm not sure that's going to be every single person's read of him or read of the story, but I did feel like it was important to point out that that was intentionally put into his character description. Now, sort of on the burgeoning of a point that I want to introduce here and then kind of expand on a little bit later, I think a huge important thing about discussing erotica featuring trans characters, while it might seem like to some people who are watching this, maybe it wasn't what you watched this series for. I know erotica is kind of hit or miss, and it definitely is for me too as a reader. Don't get me wrong. It's not something that I read really outside of, like, if I have to read it or I'm editing it. I don't often go and pick it up specifically for my own personal interest. Usually there's kind of other factors at play. But I think that its existence is super important especially when we're talking about it featuring trans characters, because it will do this thing where it will portray a character's body as desirable, which now we can get into some kind of discoursey topic about, like, where is the line in the sand between desirable and fetishizing. Now, this case is the former, not the latter. I'm pretty certain of that, but obviously it's up to interpretation in a lot of cases too, right? But I think that it should at the very least exist, because a lot of trans people, and in particular, for what I'm discussing, obviously a lot of transmasculine people, will feel like transitioning will make us uglier or less desirable, and that's a huge part of fear-mongering when it comes to taking testosterone, when it comes to top surgery, anything like that. It's one of the first things that you'll often hear when you're looking into it is, oh, it's going to give you male pattern balding, you're going to get hairy all over and sweaty and smell bad, you're going to have, like, ugly scars on your chest, and, like, none of these things should matter, right? Because if you're doing it obviously for your own health and happiness, and so you can feel at home in your body, right? That's the most important thing. But because there's so much social conditioning around, like, convincing you to stay attractive and appealing, particularly to cisgender men, the, like, fear-mongering tends to focus on the you will make yourself ugly idea. So having stories that portray these kinds of characters and these kinds of bodies in a desirable way is really important. And this story is one sort of in that category, right? That was something that, like, I enjoyed in sort of the editing process and the process of rereading it and all that, is that you have a character who, in otherwise you might see people describing negatively for his features, not being treated that way here. And that's something that I kind of hope to find more of and talk about more of later, but this is a half point because I have to come back here and discuss sort of a part 2 to this, so the pin is in place. So because I like doing these things with some level of vaguity here, and I don't want to just reiterate the whole plot for you, because I kind of want to encourage people to go out and, consume these pieces of media that I talk about, I do have to at least clarify some minor plot things. So the character of Anna meaning anomaly, approaches Sheldon, and then that sort of begins their erotic encounter. Now, Anna is the otherworldly kind of alien / demon shapeshifter who is sort of beyond gender, and that does technically qualify as a trope in terms of, like, non-binariness, and I did talk about that before, and I think that, of course, if you're following, you'll be able to see that without me having to expound too much on it. But the reason why it's kind of interesting here is because you have that paired beside a transgender character as well. So it's not like we have, like, a show or a movie and our trans rep is this otherworldly shapeshifter. We have the otherworldly shapeshifter, and then we just have, like, a regular trans dude as well. So it kind of makes the dynamic between them a little bit more interesting for me personally. Now, as the story's primary focus really is to be smut, which is totally fair, that's what it's marketed as, there's nothing really wrong with that. There is sort of an emotional arc too, and the emotional arc is focusing on Sheldon sort of gaining a bit more confidence with himself and comfort in his body. So we enter the story and he's already transitioned. So it's not like it's a transition story, but he clearly does have dysphoria still, particularly with his genitals. And then this story focuses a little bit through the erotic encounters on him alleviating that via magical alien means, and then from there gaining the confidence to pursue his longtime crush, Josephine, and then they have their encounter, and that kind of ends off the story with a bit of a body horror cliffhanger. In terms of overall representation for the story, I think you would be safest and most accurate as marketing it or recommending it as transmasculine representation, which would make sense because while there are like bits of other things in this story, that's definitely the main focus. Like Josephine is a trans woman, for example, but there's not really much focus on Josephine as a trans woman. Like we don't see a whole lot of focus on her identity or growth, right? I know that she appears a lot later in the series itself, but in this particular story, she's only really in there at the end. And then Anna, I wouldn't really recommend as non-binary rep simply for the fact that they're an otherworldly alien, which is playing a little bit too much into a trope to be like full on like NB rep that would be relatable probably for like a real non-binary person, I think that's fair to say. But those two things paired with the main character being a trans man does sort of just normalize their existence, which is also super important too. And then we kind of have to talk about the trope that I can only call magical bottom surgery. And basically what the magical bottom surgery trope is it's where you have a trans character who by some magical means has bottom surgery. In this case, a trans man who magically gets a dick, right? Now, this trope is divisive, and it's divisive for a good reason. So, on one hand, it is pure wish fulfillment. You can write this, and like it can feel alleviating to some readers because, of course, they're reading it, and it's like it. Well, in a way that wish fulfillment always is. Wish fulfillment is very, very good in terms of like a self-insert reader type thing. And we all, to some extent, probably enjoy some forms of wish fulfillment, and this is simply one of those things. The flip side of it, the reason why it is divisive, obviously, is because it's obviously not representation of bottom surgery to any meaningful degree. Like, bottom surgery is a lot different in terms of the way that your anatomy would work if you were born with a penis is a lot different than if you have bottom surgery to achieve one, right? And there's also like different kinds of bottom surgery. There's fallow and there's meta, and they're different, and there's not like the one isn't like lesser or more, like one isn't like an in between. It's like person to person, what are your needs and how it's going to help you meet your needs. And that's kind of more what it's really about. But when we're talking about erotic fiction, a lot of the times you'll see people kind of opt for magical bottom surgery as opposed to any kind of representation of real bottom surgery and how that might look, and still portraying that in like a desirable sense. And we kind of need more of the latter, right? Like, it's not so much that the trope of magical bottom surgery existing is a bad thing. It's really not. It's just wish fulfillment, which is fine. But the problem is that it kind of overtakes authentic bottom surgery rep, and we do need to see more of that. So I think that if we can get to a point where we have a lot more erotic fiction featuring trans guys who have had bottom surgery, then I think that this trope will be a little bit less divisive, because it won't be like sort of overtaking that. It won't be seen as the hotter or better way to write it. It will just be seen as another option, and we could have ideally more options in terms of things for people to read so they can feel seen by them as well. As discussed by my co-host, but I want to give my own 2 cents on it. There is sort of an inherent link between body horror and trans stories, and not all trans stories therefore contain body horror, but it's something you commonly see. And a huge reason why is because it's almost like a visceral way of representing dysphoria. And the way that it's presented in this story, I wouldn't say that it represents dysphoria per se, but it could be read that way, perhaps. That might be up to interpretation. It is followed up with in a sequel that I know that the author has freely available to read, if I'm not mistaken. So I will link where you can read, more of this series if you are interested, of course. And it's definitely more tongue-in-cheek in this particular story, so it's not necessarily diving too far into the horror aspect, but I do think that it is interesting to note that as we discuss further and we discuss more stories, we are definitely going to get into more horror and more body horror as it's representative of people having horror with their own bodies. As I've previously explained, I did help, well, I strongly aided in the publishing of the anthology. And to give you a brief overview of some of the other stories featured, there is another one that takes place in Japan. It's quite whimsical, and I would say that we're getting into monster erotica with that one. It's more yokai specific. That one actually was my favorite in the entire anthology, hilariously, but it's not trans, so it's not the focus of the discussion of this video. And then there is another one after that is sort of a Dungeons and Dragons heavily inspired setting where you have a tiefling and a large muscular smith, and they have an erotic encounter in a brothel. And then the final one definitely has the most plot and world building. It is sort of a futuristic human and android short story. It's the longest story in the anthology. I think it's around 60 pages, somewhere in that realm. And it has a lot of world building and plot, more so than any of the other stories in there do. So if you wanted something that has some more action, like fight scenes, and a bit more like relationship building, and then world building kind of interweave with that, the last one might be more your speed as well. So we're now in the final hour here. This has been a very interesting story to help bring to the world, in that I aided as a beta reader and then an editor and then an illustrator to some extent. It's been really interesting. I got to see the story develop from a work in progress where I added a lot of notes and opinions, and then I saw it change and shift as I made more suggestions, and then I saw it branch out into now an entire series. It's been really interesting to watch it start from an egg and grow into a tentacle beast. And I think that the concept of shapeshifting in regards to transness is interesting. I think that it makes sense that people view it as an inherently sort of gender fluid concept where you can be whatever you want, and it's that's sort of the crux of it. But I think in stories like this, where it is used explicitly to affirm a trans character's gender, that's sort of, it's not something I see as often as I think I would like to. And I hope that I end up, well, we will have more stories throughout this that explore shapeshifting for sure. Some popular ones, maybe some not so popular ones, but it's going to be a concept that we get to discuss further, and we get to discuss, as we build up with each video and each story, and I'm interested to see how that goes. And this is one of those stories where I definitely understand it's going to have some tropes that are a little bit hit and miss. The magical bottom surgery is a huge one that is super hit and miss. I'm personally kind of neutral on it. It doesn't really do a lot for me in terms of making me feel seen as a trans man. It does very little for me in that regard. But in a story where we have literal shapeshifting and demon aliens, or say body swapping stories, I kind of expect it. I kind of expect the fantastical elements to show up. So at the very least, I care if they're used in ways that are a little bit different than I've seen, in previous iterations. And I will give this one, while I definitely wouldn't say that it feels like it's representing bottom surgery in any way, it is using shapeshifting in a way where I don't often see that used in trans stories. So that is cool, and that was something that was interesting to engage with in the editing process. Ultimately, shapeshifting in this particular series, and even just as we've seen in the story, it represents freedom, and that's sort of what I think that's sort of the affirming aspect that you'll see in most trans stories, where you see someone go from being dysphoric to feeling more free to some degree. So, magical transition, body swapping, those stories do accomplish that. I definitely wish to see stories do that same thing while showing us transition via hormone therapy, even if it's like magical hormone therapy. I still think that's kind of interesting. Or like actual like top surgery and bottom surgery, and I do have some coming up that I know will include that, so I'm excited to explore that in more thoroughly in future stories that I cover here. I hope that you found this video to some degree interesting. I'd be curious to know how you feel about shapeshifting when it is used in trans stories, particularly in stories with transmasculine characters. How do you enjoy or not enjoy its implementation in your experience? What are ones that you do like? And if you do read this story, I would be super curious to know what you think in the comments. So, of course, there will be links where you can access the author's social media, and you can access the anthology to purchase, and you can access these stories to read. So I would love to know what you think of them, and thank you very much for watching.